When a town threw her away, two little girls chose her instead. She was dragged through the mud by her hair, barefoot and bleeding, while an entire frontier town watched in silence. They called her worthless. They called her cursed. But when two fearless little girls stepped into the road and said, "She's coming with us," everything changed. This is the story of Evelyn Hale, a woman the world discarded and the unexpected family that refused to let her go. If you want to see how far a stranger's kindness can reach, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The dust rose in small clouds around her knees as Evelyn Hale stumbled forward, her bare feet scraping across the hard-packed dirt of Saddle Ridge's main street. Margaret Crenshaw's fingers were twisted deep in her hair, yanking her head back at an angle that made stars burst behind her eyes. The pain was sharp, familiar, just another variation of the thousand hurts that had become the landscape of her existence. "This is what happens when you steal," Margaret's voice rang out across the street, pitched high and righteous for the benefit of the gathering crowd. "When you take what doesn't belong to you." Evelyn didn't fight back. There was no point. Her hands hung loose at her sides, her body moving only when pulled, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The bread she'd taken from the bakery's discard pile, stale, already marked for the hogs, had been knocked from her hands minutes ago. It lay in the dirt now, ground under someone's boot heel, as worthless as Margaret claimed Evelyn herself to be. The late afternoon sun beat down on Saddle Ridge with the particular cruelty of August in Wyoming territory, turning the air thick and heavy. Evelyn's dress, if the tattered collection of fabric and patches could still be called that, clung to her back with sweat and grime. The hem was torn, one sleeve hung by threads, and there were stains on it she'd stopped noticing months ago. Her feet were bare because she'd lost her shoes weeks back, traded for a night's shelter in a stable that had turned her out at dawn anyway. "Look at her," someone muttered from the boardwalk. "Ain't even got the decency to be ashamed." Evelyn had learned that shame required energy she no longer possessed. 3 years of widowhood had taught her that. 3 years since Daniel's death, since the creditors had taken the farm, since the slow slide from respectability into this nameless, shapeless existence on the margins of survival. In the beginning, she'd fought it. She'd tried to maintain appearances, to preserve dignity, to believe that hard work and good character would somehow be enough. She'd been wrong. The territory didn't care about dignity when you had no money. The church didn't care about character when you couldn't pay tithes. And the town didn't care about hard work when there was no husband to give it value. Margaret jerked her forward again, and Evelyn's knees buckled. She caught herself on her hands, felt the sting as small stones bit into her palms. The crowd had grown, men pausing on their way to the saloon, women stopping their shopping, children pressing close to see the spectacle. Evelyn recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson, who used to buy eggs from her farm, Mr. Thornton, who'd offered condolences at Daniel's funeral, the baker's wife, who'd once called her a friend. None of them moved to help. 3 months ago, she was sleeping in my stable, called out Henry Morrison, the livery owner. Stole 2 blankets when she left. I found her going through my trash last week, added another voice. Bold as brass, like she had a right to it. The accusations piled up like stones. Evelyn didn't respond to any of them. What would be the point? The blankets had been moldy, discarded in the corner, and the trash had been exactly that, refuse already thrown away. But the truth didn't matter when set against the comfort of collective judgment. The town needed someone to look down on, someone who made their own struggles feel less desperate by comparison. Margaret hauled her upright again, and Evelyn swayed on her feet. Blood trickled from somewhere on her scalp where hair had torn free. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges. She'd eaten nothing but wild berries and stream water for 3 days. The stale bread had seemed like a feast. "What should we do with her?" Margaret's question was performative, addressed to the crowd like a preacher calling for testimony. "Can't have her stealing from decent folk. Can't have her living like an animal in our town, bringing down the moral character of, 'She's coming with us.'" The voice was young, clear, and absolutely certain. It cut through Margaret's speech like a knife through butter, and the sudden silence that followed had weight to it. Evelyn lifted her head, though the movement sent fresh pain shooting through her skull. Through the haze of exhaustion and hurt, she saw two girls standing in the middle of the street. They couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, both wearing simple calico dresses and braided hair. Their faces were dirt-smudged and sun-browned, their boots scuffed from hard use. They stood side by side, hands clasped, forming a small barrier of determined childhood between Evelyn and the crowd. "Lila, Maggie, you girls get away from there," Margaret snapped, her grip tightening in Evelyn's hair. "This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does," the taller girl, Lila, apparently said. Her chin jutted forward with the kind of stubbornness that hadn't yet learned to be afraid of consequences. "You're hurting her." "She's a thief," Margaret said, as if explaining something simple to someone simple. "She needs to learn—" "You were throwing that bread away," Maggie interrupted, her voice softer than her sister's but no less firm. "Teacher says it's not stealing if nobody wants it anymore." A few uncomfortable shuffles rippled through the crowd. The distinction was technically accurate, though no one seemed eager to acknowledge it. "That's not the point," Margaret said, her face flushing red. "The point is she's a vagrant, a burden on decent society, and she needs food and a place to sleep and someone to help her," Lila said. "So she's coming with us." Evelyn stared at the girls, unable to reconcile their matter-of-fact tone with the impossibility of what they were saying. Children didn't intervene in adult business, especially not against someone like Margaret Crenshaw, whose husband owned half the commercial buildings in town. Children didn't stand in the street and declare rescue like it was as simple as choosing a flavor of candy. "Your father know you're here?" Margaret's voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Does Thomas Reed know his daughters are interfering with—" "He's right there," Maggie said, pointing. The crowd parted slightly, and Evelyn saw him. A man of perhaps 40, lean and weathered in the way of people who worked with their hands and didn't waste words. He wore a simple work shirt and canvas pants, both faded from washing and sun. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He held a coil of rope in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, as if he'd been interrupted in the middle of practical tasks. He didn't speak. He simply walked forward, boots making soft sounds in the dust, until he stood beside his daughters. Then he looked at Margaret Crenshaw with the kind of steady, unblinking gaze that made loud people quiet. "Let her go," he said. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of what would happen next, delivered in a voice that expected no argument. Margaret's hand loosened in Evelyn's hair. "Now, see here, Thomas, this woman is— I know who she is." He shifted slightly, putting himself between Margaret and Evelyn without making it seem like he was doing so. "And I know my daughters just invited her to our home, so unless you're planning to tell me how to raise my girls, I suggest you let her go." The power dynamics shifted in that moment, subtle but unmistakable. Margaret Crenshaw might have social standing and a wealthy husband, but Thomas Reed had something else, a reputation for quiet capability and absolute follow-through. He was the man people called when a barn needed raising, when a well needed digging, when someone needed help and didn't know where else to turn. He didn't gossip, didn't judge, didn't get involved in town politics. But when he did get involved, people listened. Margaret released Evelyn's hair with a final, spiteful shove that sent her stumbling forward. Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was firm but careful, as if he understood exactly how much pressure a person could take before breaking. "This is a mistake," Margaret said, gathering her skirts with an indignant rustle. "That woman is trouble. Mark my words, Thomas Reed, you'll regret this." "I'll bear that in mind," Thomas said, his tone suggesting he wouldn't think about it again. Margaret swept away, and with her went most of the crowd, dispersing back to their interrupted errands with the slightly disappointed air of people denied a better conclusion to the entertainment. A few lingered, watching with open curiosity, but Thomas ignored them entirely. He looked down at Evelyn, and she found she couldn't meet his eyes. Up close, she could see the details that distance had hidden, the weathered creases at the corners of his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the calluses on his hands. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and honest sweat, scents that belonged to a world of purposeful work and solid ground. "Can you walk?" he asked. Evelyn tried to answer and found her throat had closed around the words. She managed a nod instead, though in truth she wasn't certain. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unreliable. "Pa, she's bleeding," Maggie said, her small face creased with worry. "I see it." Thomas shifted his grip, taking more of Evelyn's weight without making it obvious he was doing so. "Lila, take the satchel. Maggie, you carry the rope. We're going home." The girls moved to obey immediately, collecting the items with the practiced efficiency of children accustomed to being useful. Thomas began walking, guiding Evelyn with him, his pace measured to match what she could manage. The girls fell in on either side, creating a small unit of 4 that moved as one down the street. Evelyn's feet left small traces of blood in the dust. She focused on them, on the simple fact of one foot and then the other, because looking up required acknowledging what was happening, and she didn't have the strength for that yet. Her mind felt distant, floating somewhere above the scene, observing with detachment the way this man and these children were leading her away from the town square, away from the judgmental eyes and spiteful hands. They passed the church, silent and white in the afternoon sun. They passed the schoolhouse, empty for the summer. They passed the last of the houses with their painted fences and neat gardens, moving into the territory where buildings gave way to open land, where the street became a road, where civilization thinned out into the raw country beyond. Evelyn had been this way before, on the edges of town where nobody important lived, where people like her, people with no place and no prospects, sometimes found temporary shelter in abandoned shacks or under bridge crossings. But Thomas kept walking past all of those, following the road as it curved alongside a creek, heading toward a stand of cottonwood trees that marked the boundary between the town's immediate influence and the wider world. "How much farther?" Lila asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Another mile," Thomas said. "You girls tired?" "No, sir," they chorused, though Maggie was starting to lag slightly, the rope growing heavy in her small arms. "I can take that," Thomas said, but Maggie shook her head with fierce determination. "I got it, Pa. I'm strong." "That you are." There was warmth in his voice, the kind of quiet pride that didn't need elaboration. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of boots on dirt, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant call of a hawk overhead. Evelyn's breathing grew labored, her vision narrowing to just the patch of ground in front of her feet. She didn't remember the last time she'd walked this far. Weeks of minimal food and rough sleeping had left her weaker than she'd realized. "Almost there," Thomas said, and she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the girls. The cabin appeared gradually, growing more distinct as they rounded a bend in the creek. It was small but solid, built from logs that had weathered to a silver gray. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat, suggesting someone had been cooking. A vegetable garden stretched along one side, rows of green marking beans and squash and tomatoes. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard. A small barn stood behind the house, sturdy and well-maintained. It looked like the kind of place Evelyn had once lived in, once belonged to, the kind of place that seemed like a memory from someone else's life. Thomas guided her up the porch steps, 3 of them, worn smooth in the centers from years of use, and through the front door. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine, and Evelyn's eyes took a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw a single room divided by function rather than walls. A stove and work table marked the kitchen area. A larger table with benches indicated where they ate. 2 narrow beds were pushed against one wall for the girls. A door stood open to what must be Thomas's bedroom, visible only as shadows in the corner of a larger bed frame. "Sit her down," Thomas said, nodding toward one of the chairs at the eating table. Evelyn's legs gave out as she reached the chair, and she collapsed into it more than sat. The wood was solid beneath her, real and present in a way that made the last few hours feel even more surreal. She put her hands flat on the table, partly to steady herself, partly to confirm the surface was actually there. Maggie had already dropped the rope and was pumping water into a basin at the kitchen area. Lila set the satchel down and started pulling cloths from a drawer, moving with the purpose of someone who'd performed these tasks before. Thomas crossed to the stove and lifted a pot that had been warming there, ladling something into a bowl. The smell reached Evelyn first. Chicken broth, rich and real, and her stomach cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. He set the bowl in front of her along with a spoon then stepped back to give her space. Evelyn stared at the bowl. Her hands trembled as she reached for the spoon. "Slow," Thomas said quietly. "Your stomach's probably empty. Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she could manage slow even if she tried. The first spoonful of broth touched her tongue, and she nearly wept at the taste of it, salt and fat, and the memory of what real food was like. She forced herself to take small sips, to pause between them, to let her body remember how to process nourishment. Lila appeared beside her with a damp cloth and began gently cleaning the blood from Evelyn's face and hands. The girl worked with surprising tenderness, her small fingers careful around the worst of the scrapes and cuts. Maggie brought a second cloth and started on Evelyn's feet, washing away the dirt and dried blood with the same gentle thoroughness. Evelyn sat very still and let them work, unable to speak, unable to process the simple fact of children caring for her wounds while she ate real food at a real table in a real house. Her mind kept insisting this couldn't be happening, that there would be a cost, that someone would demand payment she couldn't give. Thomas pulled out another chair and sat down across from her, his movements unhurried. He didn't stare at her, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply sat there, present but not pressing, giving her space to exist without expectation. "When you're done eating," he said eventually, "the girls will show you where you can clean up. There's a room behind the kitchen, just storage now, but it's got space for a bed. You can stay there." Evelyn's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him, trying to find the catch in his words. Men didn't offer shelter to vagrant women without expecting something in return. That was a truth she'd learned through hard experience. But Thomas's face was calm, open, his eyes meeting hers with steady honesty. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, rusty from disuse and disbelief. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Girls made you a promise," he said finally. "I don't let my daughters break promises." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving to where Lila and Maggie were still working on Evelyn's feet, their small faces serious with concentration. "Besides, a place like this always has work that needs doing. Seems to me you could use work. Seems to me we could use help. That's a fair trade." It was the most words he'd strung together since they'd left town, and Evelyn heard what he wasn't saying, that this was being offered as exchange, not charity, that he was giving her a way to stay that let her keep whatever dignity she had left. "I don't have anything," she said, needing him to understand the full extent of what he was taking in. "No money, no belongings, no—" "Didn't ask what you don't have," Thomas interrupted gently. "Asked if you can work." Evelyn's throat tightened. 3 years of running, of hiding, of being dismissed and degraded and driven away, and here was a man who cut through all of it with simple practicality. She didn't know if she could trust it. She wasn't sure she remembered how to trust anything, but the broth was warm in her belly, and the girl's hands were gentle on her skin, and the chair beneath her was solid wood that didn't shift or threaten to collapse. These were real things, present things, harder to dismiss than the voice in her head that insisted this couldn't last. "I can work," she said, and meant it. Thomas nodded once, as if that settled the matter. "Good. Then that's what you'll do." Lila finished with the last of the cuts on Evelyn's hands and stepped back to examine her work. "Pa, she needs bandages on her feet. The cuts are deep." "Get the tin from the shelf," Thomas said. "The one with the salve." Maggie ran to fetch it, returning with a small metal container that Thomas opened to reveal a thick, herb-scented ointment. He handed it to Lila, who began applying it to Evelyn's feet with the same careful attention she'd shown while cleaning them. Evelyn watched the girls work, these small strangers who'd stepped into the street and changed everything. They looked nothing alike. Lila was taller and darker, with straight hair and angular features, while Maggie was rounder and softer, with curls that escaped her braids in wild spirals. But they moved together with the synchronization of people who knew each other deeply, who communicated in glances and small gestures. "How old are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice still rough, but growing stronger. "I'm 9, Lila said. "Maggie's 8. "Almost 9, Maggie corrected. "My birthday's next month." "They're good girls," Thomas said, And there was a world of feeling compressed into those three simple words: pride and love, and perhaps something that looked like grief, carefully contained. Evelyn wanted to ask about their mother, about how a man came to be raising two daughters alone on the edge of civilization, but the questions felt too personal, too intrusive. She had no right to this family story when she'd barely been allowed to enter their space. "All done," Lila announced, sitting back on her heels. "How do they feel?" Evelyn flexed her feet experimentally. The salve had already begun to soothe the worst of the burning. "Better, thank you." "You're welcome." Lila started gathering up the cloths and basin. "Come on, Maggie, let's show her the room." The girls led Evelyn to a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked beside the stove. It opened onto a small space that had clearly been used for storage. There were still crates and barrels pushed against one wall, and shelves holding preserves and dry goods. But there was also a narrow window that let in afternoon light, and enough floor space for a bed and perhaps a small trunk. "We'll move the extra stuff out tomorrow," Lila said, already planning. "And Pa can bring in one of the spare bed frames from the barn. We've got extra blankets in the chest, the good ones Mama made. And there's a lantern you can have, though you shouldn't leave it burning at night on account of fire danger." "Lila," Maggie said softly, tugging on her sister's sleeve. "What?" "Maybe she wants to rest. We're talking too much." Lila looked chagrined. "Sorry, I get excited about projects." Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, some long frozen place beginning to thaw. "It's all right," she said. "It's good. It's—" She didn't have words for what it was, so she just repeated, "It's good." The girls left her there with promises to fetch blankets and pillows, and Evelyn stood in the small room, alone for the first time since Margaret Crenshaw had grabbed her hair in the street. The silence pressed in, but it wasn't threatening. It was just quiet, the normal quiet of a house where people lived and worked and existed without drama. She crossed to the window and looked out at the land beyond, endless grass rolling away to distant mountains, the creek cutting a green line through the brown earth, the sky impossibly big and blue above it all. Somewhere out there was the town that had thrown her away. Somewhere out there was the life she'd lost, the farm that was no longer hers, the version of herself that had believed in permanence and security. But here, in this small room, in this small cabin, was a bed she'd been offered, work she'd been trusted with, children who'd chosen her without knowing her story, without weighing her worth against her circumstances. Evelyn didn't know how to hold on to hope anymore. 3 years had taught her that hoping hurt worse than not hoping, that every time she believed things might improve, reality found new ways to prove her wrong. But standing in that room, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun through the window, smelling the lingering scent of chicken broth and honest work, she found she couldn't quite extinguish the small spark that wanted to believe this might be different. She heard Thomas moving around in the main room, heard the girls' voices raised in some minor disagreement about which blankets were best. These were the sounds of a family going about their evening, ordinary and real, and utterly foreign to someone who'd spent so long existing in the margins. Evelyn pressed her hand against the window frame, feeling the solid wood beneath her palm. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the grassland gold. Inside, someone was setting the table for supper, the clink of plates and utensils a domestic music she'd almost forgotten. For now, for tonight, she had a place. What came tomorrow could wait until tomorrow arrived. It was enough to stand here, to breathe, to let herself be inside walls instead of outside them. It was more than enough. It was everything. The first morning came too early and too bright. Evelyn woke to sunlight streaming through the small window, disoriented by the feel of a mattress beneath her instead of hard ground, by the weight of actual blankets instead of newspaper, or her own arms wrapped tight against the cold. For a moment she didn't remember where she was, and panic seized her chest. Had she broken into someone's home? Would there be consequences? Then memory returned in fragments. The street. The girls. Thomas Reed's steady hand on her elbow. The bowl of broth. The promise of work. She sat up slowly, her body cataloging its various complaints. The cuts on her feet throbbed. Her scalp ached where Margaret had torn out hair. Her muscles protested movement after months of poor nutrition and rough sleeping. But she was clean. The girls had helped her wash last night with warm water and actual soap, and she was wearing a nightgown that smelled of lavender and long storage. These small comforts felt almost dangerous, like she might grow accustomed to them and forget how to survive without. Voices drifted through the door, punctuated by the clatter of dishes and the sound of the stove being stoked. Evelyn pushed off the blankets and stood, testing her weight on her bandaged feet. The pain was manageable. She'd worked through worse. Her dress from yesterday lay folded on the room's single chair. Lila or Maggie must have washed it and hung it to dry overnight. The fabric was still damp in places, and several new tears had appeared during Margaret's assault, but it was all she had. She pulled it on, fingers fumbling with buttons that had mostly gone missing, then ran her hands through her hair in a futile attempt to manage the tangles. When she opened the door, she found the cabin transformed by morning light. Everything that had seemed dim and uncertain last night was now sharp and clear. The worn floorboards swept clean, the simple furniture solid and well-made, the window glass sparkling despite its age. Thomas stood at the stove, turning bacon in an iron skillet. The girls sat at the table, Maggie drawing something on a slate, while Lila read from a book, her lips moving silently as she worked through the words. Thomas looked up as Evelyn appeared, his face unreadable. "Morning, coffee's on the stove." Evelyn hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware she had no idea what the rules were here, what was expected, where she was supposed to be. In the past 3 years, she'd learned that every shelter came with unspoken conditions, invisible lines that brought punishment when crossed. "I don't want to intrude on your breakfast," she said carefully. "Already set a place for you," Thomas said, nodding toward the table where indeed a fourth setting waited, tin plate, cup, fork, and knife laid out with the same care as the others. "Girls, clear your things, food's ready." Maggie swept her slate and chalk into a small wooden box, while Lila marked her page and set the book aside. They moved with practiced efficiency, making space as Thomas brought the skillet to the table, along with a plate of biscuits and a jar of preserves. The portions he served were generous: 3 slices of bacon, 2 biscuits, a spoonful of preserves that gleamed amber in the morning light. Evelyn stared at her plate, throat tight. This was more food than she'd seen in a week, maybe 2. The abundance of it felt obscene after so much scarcity. "Something wrong?" Thomas asked, taking his own seat. "No, I just—" Evelyn struggled to find words that didn't sound ungrateful or reveal the full extent of her desperation. "It's a lot. Well, eat what you can," he said simply. "Rest goes to the hens if you can't finish." The girls were already eating, Maggie making a production of spreading preserves on her biscuit with intense concentration, while Lila attacked her bacon with the focused hunger of a growing child. Their easy comfort made Evelyn's stiffness more obvious. Thomas poured coffee into her cup, strong and black, steam rising in lazy curls. "Sugar's on the table if you take it." Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. The coffee was real, rich, nothing like the weak chicory substitute she'd occasionally begged from sympathetic shopkeepers. She took a sip and felt the warmth spread through her chest, loosening something that had been clenched tight for a very long time. "Pa makes good coffee," Maggie offered through a mouthful of biscuit. "Mama taught him." Lila's elbow connected with her sister's ribs, sharp and quick. Maggie's eyes went wide as she realized what she'd said. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air, some tension that hadn't been there before. "She did," he said evenly. "Your mama knew her way around a kitchen." Evelyn kept her eyes on her plate, unwilling to intrude on whatever grief lived in those simple words. The past tense told her enough. She picked up a biscuit, tore off a small piece, made herself chew and swallow despite the way emotion had narrowed her throat. "So," Thomas said, moving past the moment with deliberate purpose. "Need to discuss how this works. You staying here, I mean." Evelyn set down the biscuit, her appetite vanishing. Here it came. The conditions, the expectations, the cost of last night's kindness. "I told you there's work," Thomas continued. "Garden needs tending. Chickens need feeding and eggs need collecting. House needs keeping, cooking, cleaning, mending. Basic things." He took a drink of coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "In exchange, you get room and board. Fair trade." "That's it?" The words came out before Evelyn could stop them. "Just housework?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across Thomas's face. What else would there be? Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd learned to expect other demands, other costs that men extracted from women with nowhere else to go. The fact that Thomas seemed genuinely confused by her question made her feel both relieved and ashamed. Nothing, she said quietly. That's more than fair. Good. Then we're settled. Thomas returned his attention to his breakfast. Girls will show you around after we eat. I've got fence mending on the north pasture, won't be back till afternoon. Anything you need, ask them. Lila straightened in her chair, clearly taking her new responsibility seriously. We'll give her a proper tour, Pa. Show her where everything is. Just don't wear her out, Thomas said. Remember, she's still healing. We'll be careful, Maggie promised. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind that came from people accustomed to eating together without needing to fill every moment with conversation. Evelyn forced herself to eat slowly, to finish at least one biscuit and most of the bacon. Her stomach had already started to cramp from the sudden richness, but she didn't want to insult Thomas's hospitality by leaving too much. When the meal was done, Thomas pushed back from the table and collected his hat from a peg by the door. Sun's wasting. You girls mind your manners and don't talk her ear off. Yes, Pa, they chorused. He left without further ceremony, the door closing softly behind him. Through the window, Evelyn watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his stride long and purposeful. He moved like a man who knew exactly what needed doing and didn't see any point in delaying. He's always like that, Lila said, catching Evelyn's gaze. Doesn't waste words when work needs doing. Mama used to say he thought in full sentences but only spoke in partial ones, Maggie added, then looked stricken again. Sorry, I keep mentioning her. Lila's expression softened. It's okay. We're allowed to talk about Mama. Evelyn began gathering the dishes, needing something to do with her hands. How long has it been? 2 years, Lila said. Fever took her during the winter. Doc couldn't do anything. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children did when they'd had time to absorb a loss but hadn't yet learned to hide their feelings about it. I'm sorry. The words were inadequate, but Evelyn meant them. She knew what it was to lose someone, to have the shape of your life suddenly change in ways you couldn't control. Pa says she'd want us to remember the good parts, Maggie said, like her cooking and how she sang while she worked and the way she always knew when we needed hugs. That sounds like good remembering, Evelyn said gently. Lila stood and started clearing the rest of the table. Come on, let's show you everything so you know where things go. The tour began in the kitchen area, where Lila demonstrated the workings of the stove, how to bank the fire for slow cooking, where Thomas kept the kindling, which pots were for what purposes. Maggie showed her the pantry shelves, pointing out the preserved vegetables and dried beans and sacks of flour and cornmeal with the pride of someone who understood their value. We did most of the canning last summer, Lila explained. Pa helped, but we did the actual work. He says we're getting good at it. They moved through the cabin systematically, where the cleaning supplies were kept, where fresh linens were stored, how to work the water pump outside, which hens were the best layers and which ones would peck if you weren't careful. The girls had clearly been running the household with their father for some time, their knowledge comprehensive and their explanations detailed. Outside, they showed her the garden with its neat rows of vegetables. Tomatoes are coming in good, Lila said, pointing to plants heavy with green fruit. And the beans need picking every few days or they get tough. Squash is over there, and the herbs are by the porch. Evelyn knelt beside the bean plants, running her fingers over the leaves. She'd grown beans on her own farm, knew the feel of them, the timing of harvest. Something in her chest eased at the familiar texture, the connection to work she'd once done when she'd had purpose and place. You know gardens, Maggie observed, watching her. I had one once, Evelyn said, a long time ago. What happened to it? The question was innocent, curious, without the loaded judgment that adults would have brought to it. Evelyn considered how to answer, how much truth to offer. I lost the farm after my husband died, she said finally. Couldn't keep up with the debts. That's sad, Maggie said with complete sincerity. It was, Evelyn agreed, but gardens grow again. That's the nice thing about plants. They don't care what happened before. They just want sun and water and decent soil. Layla nodded thoughtfully. Pa says something similar about chickens. Says they're too stupid to hold grudges. Despite everything, Evelyn felt a smile tug at her mouth. That sounds like wisdom. They continued the tour, the chicken coop with its population of hens and one aggressive rooster, the barn where Thomas kept his horse and tools, the creek that provided water for washing and watering. The property was small but well maintained, everything showing signs of care and practical use rather than decoration. Do you get to town often? Evelyn asked as they walked back toward the house. Lila shook her head. Pa goes once a month for supplies. Sometimes we go with him, but mostly we stay here. We've got lessons at home. Pa teaches us reading and arithmetic. Don't you go to school? Used to, Maggie said, her voice going quiet. But after Mama died, some of the other kids' parents didn't want us there anymore. Said we'd bring bad luck or fever or something. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. She knew that fear, that irrational cruelty that people directed at grief as if loss were contagious. That must have hurt. We cried about it for a while, Lila admitted. But Pa said people are scared of things they don't understand, and death scares everybody. He said it wasn't about us, it was about them feeling safer by pushing us away. Your father sounds like a wise man. He is, Maggie said with absolute certainty. He's the best PA in the whole territory. They'd circled back to the cabin, and Evelyn found herself looking at it with new eyes. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a home built by people who'd suffered loss and kept going anyway, who'd been pushed away by a frightened community and created their own small world out here on the margins, who'd somehow managed to raise children who were kind and capable despite everything working against them. Can I ask you something? Lila said, her tone careful. Of course. Why did that woman grab your hair yesterday? What did you really do? Evelyn had been expecting this question, or something like it. She'd learned that honesty, when offered to children, was usually returned with understanding that adults couldn't manage. I took bread from behind the bakery, she said. Stale bread they were throwing away. But I didn't ask first, so they called it stealing. Were you hungry? Maggie asked. Very hungry. Then it shouldn't count as stealing, Lila said firmly. If someone's throwing something away and you need it, taking it should be allowed. A lot of people don't see it that way, Evelyn said. A lot of people are stupid, Lila declared, then caught herself. Sorry. Pa says I shouldn't call people stupid even when they're being stupid. Your pa is right about that too, Evelyn said, but without much conviction. Some people were stupid, and pretending otherwise didn't change the fact. The morning stretched into afternoon as Evelyn began actually doing the work she'd been shown. She collected eggs from the hen house, each one a small, warm miracle in her palm. She picked beans from the garden, filling a basket with the bright green pods. She swept the cabin floor and washed the breakfast dishes and started a pot of stew for supper, moving slowly but steadily through tasks that felt both foreign and familiar. The girls stayed close, but not hovering, offering help when needed, but mostly letting her work. Maggie sat on the porch and practiced her letters on the slate, while Lila read her book, occasionally looking up to check that Evelyn was still there. Still real, still staying. Around mid-afternoon, Evelyn heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up from the garden where she'd been pulling weeds to see Thomas riding in on a rangy bay gelding, fence tools strapped to the saddle. He dismounted near the barn and began unsaddling the horse with economical movements. Pa's back, Maggie announced unnecessarily, already running toward him. Evelyn watched as Thomas caught his daughter up in a brief hug, then sent her to fetch water for the horse. Lila had joined them too, reporting on the day's events with the air of someone delivering important intelligence. Thomas listened while he worked, occasionally nodding or asking a question too quiet for Evelyn to hear. When the horse was settled and the tools put away, Thomas walked toward the cabin. Evelyn realized she was still standing in the garden, dirt on her hands and probably her face, watching this family interact like someone studying a foreign language. How'd the day go? Thomas asked, stopping at the garden's edge. Good, Evelyn said, then gestured at the basket of beans. Got a decent harvest here. Should be enough for supper, and some left for preserving. Thomas looked at the basket, then at the weeded rows, then at Evelyn. You know your way around a garden. Used to. She brushed dirt from her hands, suddenly self-conscious. It comes back. Girls behave themselves? They were perfect. Evelyn glanced toward the porch where Lila and Maggie had returned to their activities. They're good at teaching, patient. Something that might have been pride crossed Thomas's face. They've had to grow up faster than they should have, but they're good girls. They are, Evelyn agreed. An awkward silence stretched between them, full of things neither seemed to know how to say. Evelyn became acutely aware of how she must look, still wearing yesterday's damaged dress, hair barely managed, face probably smudged with garden dirt. She was nobody, nothing, a charity case who happened to be useful for the moment. "Stew's on for supper," she said, needing to fill the quiet. "Should be ready in about an hour." Thomas nodded. "I'll wash up. Girls need to do their evening chores." He walked past her toward the pump, and Evelyn returned to her weeding, hands moving automatically while her mind churned. One day down. How many more would he let her stay? What would happen when the novelty wore off? When the girls got tired of having a stranger in their house? When Thomas realized that housing a homeless widow brought more trouble than her work was worth? She'd learned not to plan beyond the immediate future, not to let herself imagine permanence where none existed. But kneeling in this garden, feeling the good earth beneath her knees, hearing the domestic sounds of a family preparing for evening, she found herself wanting to hope anyway, wanting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. Supper that night was quieter than breakfast had been. The stew was well received. Maggie proclaimed it the best she'd ever tasted, though Evelyn suspected the girl was being generous. Thomas ate steadily, offering a simple, "It's good," that somehow meant more than elaborate praise would have. After the meal, as Evelyn washed dishes and the girls got ready for bed, she heard Thomas moving around in his room. He emerged carrying an armful of fabric, a dress in dark blue calico, simple but well made, with all its buttons intact. "This was my wife's," he said, setting it on the table. "Won't fit perfect, but it's better than what you're wearing. Girls and I talked about it. We'd like you to have it." Evelyn stared at the dress, unable to speak. Behind Thomas, she could see Lila and Maggie in their nightgowns, watching with serious faces. "We want you to have something nice," Maggie said softly. "Something that's really yours." Evelyn's vision blurred. She reached out and touched the fabric, good cotton, carefully stitched, made by hands that had loved the people in this house. It was the kind of gift she had no right to, the kind of generosity that carried weight beyond the object itself. "I can't," she managed. "It's too much." "It's sitting in a trunk doing nobody any good," Thomas said. "Sarah would want it used. She never liked waste." "We talked about it," Lila added. "All of us. We want you to have it." Evelyn looked at each of them, Thomas with his steady gaze, Lila with her fierce certainty, Maggie with her open heart. They were offering more than a dress. They were offering proof that she could be someone worth giving to, someone who deserved good things, someone who belonged enough to inherit what was precious. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the dress against her chest. "Thank you." That night, alone in her small room, Evelyn hung the blue dress on a nail and sat on her bed looking at it. Moonlight came through the window, turning the fabric silver. Outside, an owl called from the cottonwoods. Inside, the house settled into sleeping quiet. Evelyn lay down on clean sheets, pulled the blankets up, and let herself cry for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not the angry tears of desperation or the bitter tears of defeat, but something softer, more complicated. Relief and grief and fragile hope all tangled together. She was still nobody. She still had nothing. Tomorrow the town might remember she existed and find new ways to make her unwelcome. But tonight she had a bed and food in her belly and a blue dress hanging in moonlight like a promise. It was enough to sleep on. It was more than enough. Morning came easier the second day and easier still the third. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost natural, rising with the sun, starting the fire, putting coffee on before Thomas and the girls stirred. The blue dress fit reasonably well after she'd taken in the waist and hemmed the skirt, and wearing clean clothes that weren't falling apart changed something fundamental in how she moved through the world. The work was constant, but satisfying. Gardens didn't judge. Chickens didn't whisper. The stove heated regardless of who tended it, and bread rose for anyone who knew the proportions. Evelyn found herself remembering skills she'd thought lost. how to make soap last longer, how to get stains out of fabric with wood ash and elbow grease, how to stretch a chicken into 3 meals with careful planning. Thomas kept his distance, polite but not warm, treating her exactly as he'd promised, like someone doing work in exchange for shelter. He left early most mornings to tend his small herd of cattle, or mend fences, or do whatever other work kept a frontier homestead running. He came back tired, ate whatever she'd cooked without complaint, spoke briefly with his daughters, and retired to his room. It was a simple arrangement, clear in its boundaries. The girls were different. Lila and Maggie had attached themselves to Evelyn with the wholehearted enthusiasm children brought to new things they'd decided to love. They followed her around the cabin, asking questions, helped with chores whether she needed help or not, and chattered about everything from the neighbor's mean dog to whether the moon was made of cheese or something more sensible, like rock. "Miss Evelyn," Maggie said one afternoon while they were shelling peas on the porch, "do you think the stars are actually holes in the sky where heaven shows through?" Evelyn smiled at the theological geography. "I think they're balls of fire very far away, but I like your version better." "Pa says they're suns like ours, just too distant to warm us," Lila added, her fingers working quickly through the pods. "But he also says it's okay to think they're beautiful without knowing exactly what they are." "Your pa's full of good sense," Evelyn said. "He is," Maggie agreed, "even when he's being stubborn." "When is he stubborn?" The girls exchanged a look that contained entire conversations. "Lots of times," Lila said carefully, "like when people in town try to give him advice he didn't ask for, or when Pastor Michaels comes out here trying to get us to come back to church." Evelyn's hands stilled. "The pastor comes here?" "Used to," Maggie said, "every month or so after Mama died. He'd tell Pa that we needed spiritual guidance and community fellowship and all sorts of things that made Pa's jaw get tight." "What did your Pa say?" "He'd listen polite as could be," Lila said. "Then he'd say, 'Thank you for your concern, Pastor, but we're managing fine on our own.' And the pastor would leave looking like he'd tasted something sour." Evelyn resumed shelling, thinking about Thomas Reed turning away the comfort of organized religion. Most frontier families clung to church as their primary source of community and support. Refusing it was almost unheard of. "Did something happen?" she asked carefully. "With the church, I mean?" Lila's expression darkened. "After Mama died, some of the church ladies came by. They said nice things about helping and Christian charity, but what they really wanted was to tell Pa he couldn't raise us proper on his own. Said little girls needed a woman's influence." "Mrs. Henderson suggested he send us to live with her," Maggie added, her voice small. "Said it wouldn't be fitting for us to grow up without a mother's guidance." Evelyn felt anger kindle in her chest. She'd met Mrs. Henderson, a pinch-faced woman who measured virtue by the starch in her collars and the volume of her prayers. "What did your Pa say to that?" "He thanked her for her concern," Lila said, "and then he told her that his daughters would be raised in their own home by their own father, and if that wasn't fitting by her standards, she was welcome to keep her standards to herself." "He didn't say it mean," Maggie clarified, "but he said it final. And after that, the church ladies stopped coming by." "And we stopped going to town as much," Lila finished. "Pa said if people couldn't respect his family, he didn't need their company." Evelyn understood that isolation, the deliberate withdrawal from a community that had proven itself unreliable. She'd done the same thing herself, though in her case the withdrawal hadn't been entirely voluntary. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Church and town and other children?" Maggie considered this seriously. "Sometimes. But mostly I like it here. It's quiet, and nobody tells us we're doing things wrong all the time." "And we have you now," Lila said, as if this solved whatever lack there might have been. The casual claim of belonging made Evelyn's throat tight. 2 weeks in this house, and these children had decided she was theirs, worth keeping, worth including in their small circle of trust. She didn't know what to do with that gift except try to be worthy of it. They finished the peas in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warm on the porch boards, the sound of the creek a constant murmur in the background. Evelyn found herself thinking that this was what peace felt like. Simple work, easy company, the absence of fear. But peace, she'd learned, was never permanent. The trouble came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Evelyn's arrival. Thomas had gone to town for monthly supplies, taking the wagon and promising to be back by afternoon. The girls were doing lessons at the kitchen table while Evelyn kneaded bread dough, her hands working the rhythm she'd relearned when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Evelyn's hands stilled. Through the window, she saw 4 riders coming up the road, men she recognized from town. Her stomach dropped. She wiped flour from her hands and moved to the door, stepping out onto the porch before they could reach it. The lead rider was Douglas Crenshaw, Margaret's husband and owner of the general store. He was a thick-bodied man with a florid face and small eyes that assessed everything for its monetary value. The 3 men with him were various sorts, a ranch hand, a clerk from the land office, and Henry Morrison from the livery. "Mrs. Hale," Douglas said, his tone overly familiar. "Didn't expect to find you here." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Crenshaw, can I help you with something?" "Looking for Thomas Reed, got business to discuss." "He's in town, won't be back till afternoon." Douglas's eyes narrowed. "In town, is he? Convenient. Is there a message I can give him?" "Message?" Douglas laughed, a sound without humor. "No message, just interesting, that's all. Thomas Reed taking in charity cases." "Never thought I'd see the day." Evelyn felt the insult like a physical blow, but she kept her face still. "Was there anything else?" "My wife tells me you've been living out here," Douglas continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Playing house with Reed and his daughters. People are talking." "People always talk," Evelyn said quietly. "They do when there's reason." Douglas shifted in his saddle, making the leather creak. "Thomas Reed's a widower with 2 young girls. You're a woman with no reputation left to lose. Doesn't take much imagination to figure what arrangement you've got here." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm. Anger would only confirm whatever ugly story they were telling themselves. "I work here," she said clearly. "I keep house and tend the garden in exchange for room and board. That's all." "That what you're calling it?" Henry Morrison spoke up, his grin showing teeth gone bad. "Housework?" The other men laughed, and Evelyn felt shame burn through her despite knowing she'd done nothing wrong. This was how it worked. The accusation carried more weight than the truth, and defending yourself only made you look guilty. Behind her, she heard the cabin door open. Lila and Maggie appeared on the porch, their small faces confused and frightened. "Miss Evelyn?" Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady. "These men are just leaving." "Not quite yet," Douglas said. He looked past Evelyn to the girls. "Your pa know what kind of woman he's got living under his roof? The kind that steals and lies and worse?" "Our pa knows exactly who Miss Evelyn is," Lila said, her voice sharp with anger. "And she doesn't steal or lie. You take that back." "Lila," Evelyn said softly, "go inside." "No." Lila's small body was rigid with fury. "They're being mean and they're wrong and I won't go inside." Douglas's expression hardened. "Girl, you'd best learn some respect. Your mama would be ashamed to see you defending trash like, 'Don't you talk about our mama.'" Maggie's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to say what she'd think. You didn't even come to her funeral." The accusation landed like a stone in still water. Douglas's face flushed deeper red, and something ugly moved behind his eyes. "Your mama died because she married a stubborn fool who thought he could make it out here without proper community support," he said, cruel and deliberate. "And now that fool's bringing shame on her memory by housing a whore under the same roof as his children." Evelyn moved before she thought, putting herself between Douglas and the girls, her body a barrier. "That's enough. You've said your piece. Now leave." "Or what?" Douglas leaned forward in his saddle. "You'll make us?" "You're nothing, Evelyn Hale. You're less than nothing. And sooner or later Thomas Reed's going to realize that and throw you out just like everyone else has." The words cut because they echoed her own fears, the voice she heard in the dark hours before dawn. But looking at Douglas Crenshaw's smug face, at the casual cruelty of men who felt entitled to judge and condemn, Evelyn found something harder than fear rising in her chest. "Maybe he will," she said quietly. "But that'll be his choice, not yours. Now get off this property before I fetch his rifle and make you leave." She had no idea if there was a rifle or where it might be kept, but the bluff worked. Douglas sat back, his expression sour. "This isn't finished," he said. "People need to know what kind of situation this is, what kind of example it sets." "Then tell them," Evelyn said. "Tell them all you want, but do it away from here." Douglas jerked his horse's head around, too hard, making the animal toss its head in protest. The other men followed suit, and they rode away in a cloud of dust and muttered comments Evelyn was grateful she couldn't quite hear. She stood on the porch until they were out of sight, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then her knees gave out and she sat down hard on the steps, shaking. Lila and Maggie were on her immediately, pressing close on either side. "They're horrible," Lila said fiercely. "Everything they said was lies." "I know, honey." "Are you crying?" Maggie asked, peering at Evelyn's face. "A little. There was no point in lying. Sometimes mean words hurt even when we know they're not true." "Pa says people are meanest when they're scared," Maggie said. "What are they scared of?" Evelyn wrapped an arm around each girl, pulling them close. "I don't know. Maybe they're scared of things being different from how they think they should be. Maybe they're scared of people making choices they don't understand." "That's stupid," Lila declared. "It is," Evelyn agreed, "but stupid doesn't make it less real." They sat together on the porch steps, three females in a world that often had little use for women without men to validate their existence. Evelyn thought about Douglas's words, about the assumptions people would make, about how quickly reputation could be destroyed and how hard it was to rebuild. "Miss Evelyn?" Maggie's voice was very small. "Are you going to leave?" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "Lynette, that might not be my choice." "What do you mean?" "Your pa might decide it's too much trouble keeping me here. Might decide those men are right about the talk I'll bring." "Pa doesn't care about talk," Lila said with absolute certainty. "He cares about what's right and what's real. And what's real is you work hard and you're kind and you make good biscuits." Despite everything, Evelyn smiled. "I do make good biscuits." "The best," Maggie confirmed. "Better than Mrs. Henderson's, and she won first prize at the county fair." They stayed on the porch until the sun shifted and reminded them of work still undone. Evelyn got up, brushed off her skirt, and went back to the bread dough that had been rising while her world tilted. The girls returned to their lessons, but they kept looking up at her, checking that she was still there, still real, still staying. Thomas returned just before supper, the wagon loaded with supplies and his face showing the kind of tiredness that came from dealing with too many people in too short a time. He began unloading without comment, carrying sacks of flour and cornmeal into the pantry with methodical efficiency. Evelyn waited until the girls had gone to feed the chickens before she told him about the visitors. She kept her voice level, reporting facts without editorial, but she saw his jaw tighten as she described Douglas's accusations. He said, "What about Sarah?" Thomas's voice was quiet, dangerous. "That she died because you were stubborn, that you didn't have proper community support." Thomas set down the sack he'd been holding with deliberate care. "And what did you say?" "I told him to leave." "Before or after my daughters defended you?" "After. They were very brave." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting flat on the pantry shelf. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I knew there'd be talk eventually, knew people would make assumptions, but I didn't think they'd come out here and say it to your face." "It's not your fault what other people choose to believe." "Isn't it?" He turned to look at her, his eyes tired. "I brought you here. I put you in a position where people could make those assumptions." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "You offered me work and shelter when I had nothing. I'm not sorry for that, even if other people are." "They'll make your life harder," Thomas said. "Already has been hard, but this will make it worse. When we go to town, people will stare, whisper, maybe refuse to serve you. They'll treat you like what Douglas accused you of being." "They already treated me like that," Evelyn said quietly. "At least here I have a roof and food and children who believe the best of me instead of the worst." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You planning to stay then, even knowing what it'll cost?" Evelyn thought about that blue dress hanging in her room, about Lila's fierce defense and Maggie's gentle questions, about the rhythm of work that gave shape to her days and the absence of fear that let her sleep at night. "If you'll have me," she said, "I'd like to stay." The next morning, Thomas announced at breakfast that he was taking the whole family to church that Sunday. The girls' surprise was immediate and vocal. "Church?" Lila nearly dropped her fork. "We haven't gone to church in over a year." "Time to change that," Thomas said calmly, buttering his biscuit. "Why?" Maggie asked suspiciously. "Because people are saying things that need correcting, and if we hide out here, we're letting them control the story." He looked at Evelyn. "You'll come with us." It wasn't quite a question, but Evelyn heard the choice in it anyway. She could refuse, stay behind, let Thomas and the girls go alone. It would be easier, safer, less confrontational. "All right," she said, "I'll come." Sunday arrived with oppressive heat and cloudless sky. Evelyn wore the blue dress, her hair braided and pinned as neatly as she could manage without a proper mirror. The girls wore their best calico, faces scrubbed until they shone. Thomas put on a clean shirt and his Sunday vest, the one Sarah had made him years ago with careful stitches. The drive to town was quiet, all four of them understanding what they were riding toward. Evelyn sat in the wagon bed with the girls while Thomas drove, watching the familiar landmarks roll past. The creek crossing, the stand of cottonwoods, the place where the road curved past the Morrisons' pasture. When they reached the church, people were already gathering outside. Conversations died as Thomas pulled the wagon up. Heads turned, eyes assessed and judged and whispered to neighboring ears. Thomas climbed down, then helped each of his daughters, then offered his hand to Evelyn. She took it, his grip steady and sure, and stepped down into the dusty churchyard full of people who thought they knew her story. Margaret Crenshaw stood near the church steps, her face a mask of righteous disapproval. Mrs. Henderson clutched her Bible like a weapon. Pastor Michaels emerged from the church, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with interest. Thomas kept Evelyn's hand in his as they walked toward the church entrance. Lila and Maggie flanked them like small soldiers, chins up, eyes forward. The crowd parted reluctantly, creating a path that felt more like a gauntlet. "Thomas," Pastor Michaels said as they approached, "good to see you, and your daughters, and—" He trailed off, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Mrs. Hale," Thomas supplied. "She's working for us. Figured she deserved a Sunday off and a chance at spiritual reflection same as anyone." The pastor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course, everyone is welcome in the house of the Lord." "Glad to hear it," Thomas said, and walked past him into the church. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Evelyn's eyes a moment to adjust. Wooden pews stretched toward a simple altar, the space plain but clean. Thomas led them to a pew 3 rows from the front, not the back where shame hid, not the very front where pride displayed itself, but somewhere in the middle where regular people sat. They settled in, Thomas on the aisle, then the girls, then Evelyn on the far end. The church filled slowly around them, people choosing pews with careful deliberation, some closer, some conspicuously farther away. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, trying to ignore the weight of stairs on her back. Pastor Michaels took his place at the pulpit and launched into his sermon without preamble. The text was from Matthew, something about judging not lest ye be judged, and Evelyn wondered if the pastor had chosen it specifically for this occasion, or if the irony was accidental. She tried to listen, tried to find some comfort in the familiar rhythms of scripture and exhortation, but her mind kept drifting to the people behind her, to the whispers she couldn't quite hear, to the assumptions being made about her character and her choices. Beside her, Maggie reached over and took her hand, small fingers wrapping around hers with fierce protectiveness. On Maggie's other side, Lila sat ramrod straight, radiating defiance. Thomas stared at the pulpit with the same steady attention he gave everything, as if daring anyone to question his right to be there with his family. His family. The thought caught Evelyn by surprise. When had she started thinking of herself as part of that unit, as someone who belonged in this configuration of people? The service ended eventually. Pastor Michaels offered a closing prayer, people shuffled to their feet, and the slow exodus began. Thomas didn't rush. He let people file past, meeting eyes when they were offered, ignoring those who turned away. When the pew was clear, he stood and gestured for his daughters and Evelyn to precede him. They made it halfway down the aisle before Margaret Crenshaw stepped directly into their path. A word, Thomas, she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. If you have a moment. Thomas stopped. Mrs. Crenshaw, I wanted to speak with you about your situation. Margaret's eyes flicked to Evelyn with barely concealed disgust. As a concerned member of the community and someone who knew your dear departed wife. My situation is my own business, Thomas interrupted quietly. And Sarah's memory doesn't need defending from people who barely knew her. Margaret's face flushed. I'm simply trying to help. Surely you understand how this looks, having that woman living under your roof? That woman has a name, Lila said loudly. It's Miss Evelyn, and she's good and kind, and she takes care of us. Lila, hush, Margaret snapped. Children shouldn't speak of adult matters they don't understand. I understand fine, Lila shot back. I understand you're being mean because… Lila, Thomas's voice was soft but firm. That's enough. Lila subsided, but her expression remained mutinous. Thomas looked at Margaret with the kind of patience usually reserved for dealing with difficult livestock. Mrs. Crenshaw, I appreciate your concern, but it's misplaced. Mrs. Hale works for me. She keeps my house and helps raise my daughters. The arrangement is proper and mutually beneficial. If that troubles you, I suggest you examine your own assumptions rather than my choices. But the appearance of it, Margaret began. The appearance is exactly what it is, Thomas said. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have chores waiting at home. He moved forward, and Margaret had no choice but to step aside or be walked through. The girls followed immediately, and Evelyn brought up the rear, feeling Margaret's glare like heat on her back. Outside, the bright sun felt like a blessing. Thomas helped them into the wagon without comment, then climbed up himself and took the reins. As they pulled away, Evelyn looked back to see clusters of people watching, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and in a few cases, something that might have been sympathy. They were half a mile from town before Maggie spoke. That was scary. Yes, it was, Thomas agreed. But we did it, Lila said with satisfaction. We went and we stayed, and we didn't let them make us ashamed. No, we didn't, Thomas said. I'm proud of you both. Miss Evelyn, too? Maggie asked. Thomas glanced back at Evelyn, his expression unreadable. Miss Evelyn, too. She showed real courage today. Evelyn looked down at her hands, at the blue fabric of Sarah Reed's dress, at the dust settling on the hem. She'd survived worse than Margaret Crenshaw's disapproval. She'd survived hunger and cold and the slow erosion of everything she'd once believed about herself and the world. But this deliberate choice to stand visible, to claim space in a community that wanted her invisible, this was a different kind of survival. This was the beginning of something she didn't quite have words for yet, something that felt like the opposite of running away. The wagon rolled on toward home, toward the cabin by the creek where chickens needed feeding and bread needed baking, and two little girls needed someone to believe they were worth defending. Behind them, the town receded into distance. Ahead, the mountain stood solid against the sky. Evelyn took a deep breath and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she could do this. Maybe she could stay. Maybe she could build something here that wouldn't crumble the moment she dared to trust it. It was a fragile hope, easily broken. But it was hope nonetheless, and that was more than she'd had in a very long time. The fragile hope lasted exactly 4 days. On Thursday afternoon, Evelyn was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard a horse approaching at speed. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the rider. Daniel's brother, Jacob Hale, hadn't changed much in 3 years. Still lean and hard-eyed, still carrying himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who'd never been told no and didn't plan to start hearing it now. He reined in his horse hard enough to make it dance sideways, then dismounted with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested an audience even when none existed. Evelyn stayed where she was in the garden, dirt on her hands and knees, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying false warmth. "Been a long time." "Not long enough," she replied quietly. Jacob's smile thinned. "That any way to greet family? You stopped being family when you took the farm." "Took?" Jacob's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "That's a harsh word. I paid the debts, same as anyone would have. Not my fault Daniel left you in such a mess." Evelyn's hands clenched around the weeds she'd been pulling. This was old ground, old arguments, old wounds that had never properly healed. Jacob had swooped in after Daniel's death with legal papers and sympathetic expressions, offering to help by taking over the farm's debts. She'd been too grief-stricken and exhausted to understand what she was signing until it was too late, until she realized he'd maneuvered her into losing everything while making it look like charity. "What do you want, Jacob?" "Heard you landed on your feet." He looked past her toward the cabin, assessment in his gaze. "Or on your back, depending on who's telling the story." The insult was casual, practiced, the kind of cruelty he delivered with a smile. Evelyn felt heat rise in her face, but kept her voice level. "I work here, that's all." "Sure you do." Jacob took a step closer, and Evelyn fought the urge to step back. "Thing is, people are talking, and some of that talk's reaching folks who knew Daniel, knew you when you were respectable. Makes me look bad my brother's widow living in sin out here in the middle of nowhere." "I'm not living in sin, and what people think is their problem, not yours." "See, that's where you're wrong." Jacob's expression hardened. "You're still a Hale, like it or not. What you do reflects on the family name, and right now you're making us look like trash." Behind her, Evelyn heard the cabin door open. She didn't turn to look, but she felt the shift in Jacob's attention, saw his eyes move past her shoulder. "Something I can help you with?" Thomas's voice was even, but there was steel underneath. Jacob's smile returned, sharper now. "You must be Reed. Jacob Hale, Evelyn's brother-in-law." Thomas moved to stand beside Evelyn, not touching, but close enough that his presence was a statement. "I know who you are." "Then you know I've got a legitimate interest in my sister-in-law's welfare." Jacob's tone suggested reasonableness, but his eyes were calculating. "Been hearing things about her situation here. Wanted to see for myself that everything's proper." "Everything's proper," Thomas said flatly. "Is it?" Jacob looked between them, his gaze lingering on Evelyn's dress, Sarah's dress, with pointed interest. Woman living alone with a widower and his children? People are bound to wonder about the arrangement. "People can wonder all they like," Thomas said. "Doesn't change facts." "Facts?" Jacob drew the word out. "Fact is, Evelyn here's got no reputation left. Fact is, she's living off your charity. Fact is, sooner or later you're going to realize what a burden she is and turn her out. And when that happens, she'll come crawling back to family." "I'd die first," Evelyn said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Jacob's expression went cold. "Careful, Evelyn. You might not have many options left, but you've still got some. I'm offering you a chance to do this dignified before you embarrass yourself further." "What are you offering?" Thomas asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Simple solution," Jacob said. "Evelyn comes back to work for me. I've got a household that needs managing, and she knows the work. Room and board, respectable position, no ugly talk about improper situations." He looked at Evelyn. "It's more than fair, considering." Evelyn felt sick. She knew exactly what Jacob's offer meant. Unpaid labor disguised as family obligation, isolation in a house where he could control every aspect of her existence, no escape and no recourse, because who would take the word of a destitute widow over a prosperous landowner? "No," she said. "No?" Jacob's voice rose slightly. "You're saying no to family, to respectability, to a legitimate position?" "I'm saying no to you," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'd rather stay here and face whatever talk comes than spend one day under your roof." Jacob's face flushed dark red. "You ungrateful. After everything I did for you, taking on Daniel's debts, trying to help you, you took the farm," Evelyn interrupted, finding courage in anger. "You took everything we'd built, everything Daniel worked for, and you called it help. You didn't save me, Jacob. You stripped me bare and left me with nothing." "I paid legal debts," Jacob snapped. "That land was collateral. If Daniel had managed his affairs better—" "Daniel was sick," Evelyn's voice cracked. "He was dying and doing everything he could to keep us afloat, and you waited until he was in the ground before you swooped in with your papers and your lawyers and your lies about trying to help." The words came pouring out, 3 years of suppressed fury and grief and betrayal finally finding voice. Thomas stood solid beside her, and she drew strength from his presence, from the fact that she wasn't alone this time. Jacob took a step toward her, his hand raised, and Thomas moved faster than Evelyn had ever seen him move. He was between them in an instant, his hand catching Jacob's wrist in a grip that made the other man wince. "Touch her, and we'll have a problem," Thomas said quietly. Jacob jerked his arm free, rubbing his wrist. "You threatening me?" "Stating facts," Thomas said. "Same as you were doing. Fact is, Mrs. Hales made her choice. Fact is, she works for me and lives under my protection. Fact is, you're on my property uninvited. I suggest you leave." "This isn't over," Jacob said, his voice tight with fury. "You think you can play house out here with my brother's widow, and there won't be consequences? I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of arrangement this really is. I'll make sure the law takes an interest in how you're running this household." "The law's welcome to visit any time," Thomas said. "I've got nothing to hide." Jacob spat in the dust, deliberate and crude. "You're making a mistake, Reed, and you—" He pointed at Evelyn. "You'll regret this. Mark my words." He swung back onto his horse and rode off without looking back, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Evelyn stood frozen, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of confrontation. She'd stood up to Jacob Hale. She'd refused him. She'd told the truth about what he'd done, and she was still standing. "You all right?" Thomas asked quietly. Evelyn nodded, then shook her head, then found she couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Thomas guided her to the porch steps and made her sit, then disappeared into the cabin. He returned with a cup of water and sat down beside her, not touching, but present. "Drink," he said. She drank, the water cool and clean, steadying. Her hands still shook, but less violently. "He took the farm," she said finally, needing Thomas to understand. "After Daniel died, I couldn't keep up with the payments. Jacob offered to help, said he'd take care of the debts if I signed some papers. I was so tired, so lost, I didn't read them properly. Didn't understand that I was signing everything over to him. By the time I realized, it was too late." "That's why you ended up on the street," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "I had nowhere else to go. No family except Jacob, and I wouldn't." Her voice broke. "You don't have to explain," Thomas said. "I understand enough." They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon sun slanting long shadows across the yard. Inside, Evelyn could hear the girls moving around, probably trying to listen while pretending not to. "He'll make trouble," Evelyn said eventually. "He meant what he said about telling people, about getting the law involved. He'll find a way to make this harder for you." "Let him try," Thomas said. "I'm not afraid of Jacob Hale or his threats." "You should be," Evelyn said urgently. "He's vindictive and he's got money and influence. He could make things very difficult for you and the girls." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. "You planning to leave?" he asked finally. "To protect us from that difficulty?" Evelyn's throat closed. The offer was implicit. She could go, remove herself from the situation, take the burden of scandal with her. It would be the selfless thing, the right thing, the kind of sacrifice that would leave Thomas and the girls untouched by her complicated past. "I don't want to," she whispered. "Then don't," Thomas said simply. "We'll handle whatever comes." "But the girls need someone who'll fight for them the way you just fought for yourself," Thomas interrupted. "They need to see that standing up to bullies matters, that you don't give in just because someone threatens you. You think I'm going to teach them to run from trouble? To sacrifice good people to keep bad people happy?" Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face she hadn't let herself see before. This wasn't just practical charity. This wasn't just convenient arrangement. Thomas Reed had made a choice about who deserved protection and who deserved defending, and she was on the right side of that line. "I won't let you regret this," she said. "I won't," Thomas said with certainty. "Now come on. Those girls are probably pressed against the window trying to hear every word." He was right. When they went inside, Lila and Maggie were suspiciously close to the window, their faces showing the kind of forced innocence that meant they'd heard everything. "That man was mean," Maggie announced. "He was," Thomas agreed. "Is he really Miss Evelyn's family?" Lila asked. "By marriage," Evelyn said. "But that doesn't mean much when there's no love behind it." "Are you going to leave?" Maggie's voice was small, frightened. Evelyn knelt down so she was eye level with the girl. No, sweetheart, I'm not leaving. Promise? Maggie's eyes were wide, desperate for reassurance. Evelyn hesitated. She'd learned not to make promises she couldn't keep, not to offer certainties in an uncertain world. But looking at Maggie's face, at Lila's barely concealed worry, at Thomas standing steady behind them, she found herself saying the words anyway. I promise, I'm staying. Maggie threw her arms around Evelyn's neck, squeezing tight. Lila joined in after a moment, and they stood there in a tangle of arms and emotion while Thomas watched with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. That night, after the girls were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Evelyn sat in her small room staring at the wall. The confrontation with Jacob had shaken something loose inside her, some final resistance to believing this could last. She'd defended herself. She'd refused to go back to a life of servitude and shame. She'd promised 2 little girls she wouldn't leave them, and Thomas had stood beside her through all of it. The realization settled over her like a blanket. She wasn't just working here anymore. She wasn't just surviving day to day, taking what shelter she could find while waiting for it to be withdrawn. Somewhere in the past month, without her quite noticing, she'd started building something real. She'd started to belong. The thought terrified her, because belonging meant having something to lose. It meant caring about these people, this quiet man and his fierce daughters, in ways that would hurt when it ended. And it would end. Everything ended. Evelyn had learned that lesson too well to forget it now. But maybe, a small voice whispered, maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time she could let herself hope without it destroying her. Maybe she could be brave enough to stay, to fight, to claim this fragile new life with both hands and refuse to let go. She heard footsteps in the main room, soft and careful. Then a gentle knock on her door. It's me, Thomas said quietly. Can I come in? Evelyn opened the door to find him holding a lantern, his face shadowed and uncertain in the flickering light. Couldn't sleep, he said. Figured you might not be sleeping either. No, Evelyn admitted. Too much in my head. Thomas nodded. What Jacob said today, about people talking, about the law taking interest, he wasn't entirely wrong. This arrangement we've got, it leaves room for people to make assumptions, leaves you vulnerable. Evelyn's heart sank. Here it came. The practical reassessment, the realization that she was more trouble than she was worth. I understand, she said carefully. If you need me to... What I need, Thomas interrupted, is to make sure you're protected, properly protected, in a way that gives people no room for ugly talk. He took a breath. I'm asking if you'd consider marriage. Legal and binding, but in name only if that's what you want. It would give you status, protection, a legitimate place here that nobody could question. Evelyn stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. You're asking me to marry you? For practical reasons, Thomas said quickly. I'm not expecting anything beyond what we already have, separate rooms, separate lives in that way, but on paper, in the eyes of the law and the community, you'd be my wife. The girls would have a mother. Nobody could threaten you or claim you're here improperly. Evelyn's mind raced. That's too much. You can't bind yourself to me just to stop gossip. I can do what I think is right, Thomas said. And this feels right. Girls need you. I need the help you provide. And you deserve security, real security, not just day-to-day shelter that could disappear if I change my mind or something happens to me. What about you? Evelyn asked. What about finding someone you actually want to marry? Someone who... I married for love once, Thomas said quietly. Sarah was everything good in my life. I don't expect that again, and I'm not looking for it. But I can offer partnership, respect, and protection. That seems like enough to build on. Evelyn's hands were shaking. A marriage in name only, legal protection, a real place in this family instead of a temporary arrangement that could end at any moment. It was practical, sensible, the kind of solution that solved multiple problems at once. It was also terrifying. I need to think about it, she said. Of course, Thomas said. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands. He left her alone with the lantern and her tumbling thoughts. Marriage, to Thomas Reed, a man she barely knew despite living under his roof, despite sharing meals and work and the daily intimacy of domestic life. A man who'd never given her reason to fear him, who treated her with steady respect, who let his daughters love her without reservation. a man offering shelter in a way that couldn't be taken away. Evelyn lay awake long into the night, weighing possibilities against each other. She thought about Jacob's threats, about Margaret Crenshaw's disapproval, about the whispers that would only grow louder as time went on. She thought about Lila and Maggie, about the promise she'd made to stay, about how easily that promise could be broken if circumstances changed. She thought about Thomas standing beside her when Jacob raised his hand, about the way he'd said, "We'll handle whatever comes," like it was simple fact, about the offer he'd just made, not out of desire but out of decency, because he saw a problem and knew how to fix it. By the time morning light crept through her window, Evelyn had made her decision. She found Thomas in the barn, already up and working despite the early hour. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll do it," Evelyn said before she could lose her nerve. "I'll marry you, if the offer's still open." Thomas set down the pitchfork he'd been holding. "It's open." "Just to be clear," Evelyn said, needing the terms stated plainly, "this is a practical arrangement, for protection and propriety. Nothing more." "Nothing you don't want it to be," Thomas agreed. "We'll tell people whatever story makes sense. Courtship that nobody noticed, decision made for the girl's sake, whatever keeps the gossip manageable. Pastor Michaels can marry us quiet, just family present." "The girls, do they know you were going to ask me?" "Not yet. Wanted your answer first." Thomas studied her face. "You sure about this? Once it's done, it's done. No easy way to undo a marriage." Evelyn thought about that, the permanence of it, the binding nature of legal vows. 3 years ago, the idea would have terrified her. Now it felt like the safest thing she could imagine. "I'm sure," she said. "Then we'll tell the girls at breakfast," Thomas said, "and I'll ride to town this afternoon, talk to the pastor about a quiet ceremony, soon as possible, before Jacob or anyone else can cause more trouble." They stood in the barn with morning light streaming through the gaps in the boards, two people about to make a monumental decision for the most practical of reasons. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't even particularly emotional, but it was real and it was solid, and it was the first time in 3 years that Evelyn had felt like she was choosing her own future instead of just surviving whatever happened to her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this, for everything." Thomas nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. Seemed like the right thing to do. "It is," Evelyn said. "It really is." At breakfast, Thomas cleared his throat in a way that made both girls immediately alert. "Got something to discuss," he said. "Something that affects all of us." Lila and Maggie exchanged worried glances. "I've asked Mrs. Hale to marry me," Thomas continued, "and she's said yes. We'll have a small ceremony, just family, then she'll be your stepmother, proper and legal." There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Maggie's face split into the brightest smile Evelyn had ever seen. "Really?" she breathed. "You're going to be our mama?" "If you'll have me," Evelyn said, her throat tight. Maggie was out of her chair and in Evelyn's lap in an instant, arms wrapped tight around her neck. "Yes, yes, yes. Can I call you Mama? Is that allowed?" Evelyn looked at Thomas, uncertain. He nodded slightly. "If you want to," Evelyn said. "If it feels right." Lila was slower to react, her face serious as she processed the information. "This is because of what that man said yesterday," she said finally. "You're getting married so nobody can say mean things about Miss Evelyn being here." "That's part of it," Thomas admitted, "but it's also because it makes sense, because Mrs. Hale's already family in all the ways that matter. This just makes it official." Lila looked at Evelyn, her eyes searching. "Do you want to marry Pa? Or are you just doing it because you have to?" It was a fair question, asked with the brutal honesty children brought to important matters. Evelyn considered how to answer truthfully. "I want to stay here," she said carefully. "I want to keep taking care of you and your Pa. I want to have a real place in this family, and getting married is the best way to make sure that happens. So yes, I want to. Maybe not for the usual reasons, but I want to." Lila seemed satisfied with this. "Okay, then I think it's a good idea." She paused. "Will you sleep in Pa's room?" "Lila," Thomas said, a warning in his voice. "What? I'm just asking. People who get married usually share a room." We'll work out the details, Thomas said firmly. Main thing is, are you girls all right with this? Yes! Maggie squeezed Evelyn tighter. We're getting a mama! I'm all right with it, Lila said, as long as everybody's happy. Then it's settled, Thomas said. He looked at Evelyn across the table. I'll talk to the pastor today. We can do the ceremony this weekend if he's available. This weekend. 3 days away. Evelyn felt reality crash over her in a wave. She was going to marry Thomas Reed. She was going to become a wife again, a mother to 2 girls who'd already claimed her heart. She was going to have legal protection and social standing and a permanent place in a home. She was going to have everything she'd lost, given back in a different form by people who barely knew her but had chosen her anyway. This weekend, she echoed, trying the words on for size. That's good. Yes, good. Thomas's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Try not to sound too enthusiastic. Despite everything, Evelyn laughed. Sorry, this is a lot. It is, Thomas agreed, but we'll manage. We always do. And looking at him across the breakfast table, at Maggie still clinging to her, at Lila watching them all with cautious hope, Evelyn believed him. They would manage. They would make this strange, practical arrangement work because the alternative was giving up, and none of them were the giving up kind. 3 days until her wedding, 3 days until everything changed again. But this time, Evelyn was walking toward the change instead of being dragged through it. This time, she was choosing. It made all the difference in the world. The 3 days passed in a blur of activity that left Evelyn little time for doubt. There were practical matters to attend to. Thomas rode to town and returned with news that Pastor Michaels had agreed to perform a quiet ceremony at the cabin on Saturday afternoon. The girls threw themselves into preparations with the kind of enthusiasm that made Evelyn's heart ache, scrubbing the cabin until it gleamed and picking wildflowers to arrange in jars around the main room. It needs to be special, Maggie insisted, standing on a chair to hang a garland of sage and late summer blooms above the door. Even if it's small, it should feel like a real wedding. Lila had appointed herself keeper of propriety, consulting a book on etiquette she'd found tucked away in her mother's things. It says here the bride should wear something new, something old, something borrowed, and something blue. Do you have those things? Evelyn looked down at the blue dress she wore every day, Sarah's dress, both borrowed and blue. I think I'm covered on 2 counts already. But what about new and old? Lila pressed. Thomas, working at the table mending a harness, spoke without looking up. There's a box in my room, top shelf of the wardrobe. Bring it here. Lila scrambled to obey, returning with a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Thomas set aside his work and opened it, revealing a delicate lace collar wrapped in tissue paper. This was my mother's, he said, lifting it carefully. She wore it when she married my father. Sarah wore it at our wedding. If you want it, it covers the old and the borrowed both. Evelyn touched the lace with trembling fingers. It was beautiful, intricate work that spoke of patient hands and careful preservation. I can't. It's too precious. It's meant to be worn, Thomas said, and passed down. Seems right that you should have it. What about new? Maggie asked, ever practical. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. When he unwrapped it, a simple gold band gleamed against the fabric. Bought this in town yesterday. Nothing fancy, but it's yours. Evelyn stared at the ring. She'd sold her first wedding band months ago, traded it for food when desperation had overcome sentiment. She'd thought she'd never wear one again, never have the right to that small symbol of belonging. Thank you, she whispered, because words felt inadequate, but she had to say something. Thomas cleared his throat, uncomfortable with emotion. Well, that's settled then. Friday evening brought unexpected visitors. Evelyn was kneading bread dough when she heard horses approaching, more than one, moving at an easy pace rather than the aggressive speed that usually meant trouble. She wiped her hands and went to the door, Thomas already there, his expression cautious. 3 riders came into view. Evelyn recognized the first one immediately, John Patterson, who owned the farm adjacent to Thomas's property. His wife Emma sat behind him, and their teenage son rode alongside. They were simple people, hard-working, the kind who kept to themselves and judged by actions rather than gossip. Thomas, John called out as he dismounted. Hope we're not intruding." "Never an intrusion," Thomas said, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment. "What brings you out here?" Emma Patterson climbed down with her husband's help, carrying a covered basket. "We heard you're getting married tomorrow. Thought we'd bring by a few things." She smiled at Evelyn, warm and genuine. "Congratulations, dear. It's good news." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. After so much judgment, so much cruelty, this simple kindness felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very kind." "Brought some preserves and a jar of honey," Emma continued, setting the basket on the porch. "And I made you a cake. Nothing fancy, but a wedding ought to have cake." "There's also this," John said, pulling a bottle from his saddlebag. "Good whiskey, for toasting." Thomas accepted the bottle with visible surprise. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to," John said firmly. "You've been a good neighbor, Thomas. Helped us out more times than I can count. When I heard people talking ugly about your situation, didn't sit right with me." He looked at Evelyn. "Don't know your full story, ma'am, but I know Thomas Reed doesn't make foolish choices. If he's marrying you, that's good enough for me." "For us," Emma corrected, nudging her husband. "For all of us. There's more folks in town than you might think who aren't interested in Margaret Crenshaw's version of morality." "Mama made you this," their son added shyly, holding out a small wrapped package. Inside was a handkerchief, delicately embroidered with tiny flowers. "For happy tears," Emma said. "Every bride needs one." Evelyn accepted this gift with shaking hands, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. These people owed her nothing. They'd barely known her when she'd lived in town before, had probably heard every ugly rumor about her current situation. But they'd come anyway, bringing gifts and goodwill and the message that not everyone had condemned her. "Stay for supper," Thomas said suddenly. "It's the least we can offer." Emma looked pleased. "We'd be honored." The evening that followed was unlike anything Evelyn had experienced since arriving at the cabin. The Pattersons filled the space with easy conversation and genuine warmth, treating Evelyn like she already belonged, rather than like someone on trial. John and Thomas talked about cattle prices and fence repairs, while Emma helped Evelyn finish preparing the meal, chatting about her own wedding years ago and offering advice without being intrusive. "The secret to a good marriage," Emma said as they set the table together, "is remembering you're on the same side. Even when you disagree, even when things get hard, you're partners. Sounds simple, but it's easy to forget when life gets complicated." "This arrangement," Evelyn said quietly, "it's not exactly conventional." Emma gave her a knowing look. "Most good marriages aren't, when you get down to it. People make all kinds of bargains with each other, for land, for security, for companionship. What matters is whether you treat each other with respect and work toward the same goals. From what I can see, you and Thomas are doing just fine on both counts." After the Pattersons left, the cabin felt warmer somehow, as if their visit had changed the very air. Thomas stood on the porch watching their lantern light disappear down the road, his expression thoughtful. "Didn't expect that," he said when Evelyn joined him. "Neither did I." "There's good people mixed in with the bad ones," Thomas said. "Sometimes you have to wait a while to see which is which." That night, Evelyn lay in her small room for the last time, trying to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Pastor Michaels would arrive. There would be vows and a ring and legal words that bound her to Thomas Reed in the eyes of law and community. Then what? They'd continue as before, working side by side, raising the girls together, building something that looked like family even if it hadn't started with love? The thought wasn't as cold as it should have been. Somewhere in the past weeks, Evelyn had learned that there were different kinds of love. Not just the passionate romance of her first marriage, but also the steady regard that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was even better, more sustainable, less likely to shatter when tested. She fell asleep holding the handkerchief Emma Patterson had given her, its tiny flowers soft against her cheek. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of late summer day that felt like a gift. Evelyn woke early, her stomach tight with nerves, and found Thomas already up and working outside. Through the window she could see him chopping wood with methodical precision, working off his own tension in the most practical way available. The girls were still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's preparations. Evelyn moved quietly through the cabin, starting coffee and beginning breakfast, needing the familiar rhythm of work to steady her hands. When Thomas came in, his shirt damp with sweat and sawdust in his hair, he stopped short at the sight of her. "You all right?" he asked. "Nervous," Evelyn admitted. "You?" "Same." He poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate. "Been thinking maybe we should talk about expectations. After today, I mean." Evelyn's heart hammered. "All right." Thomas sat down at the table, gesturing for her to join him. "This is a legal marriage. That means you'll have rights to this property, to protection under my name, to make decisions about the girl's welfare. I want you to understand that. This isn't just for show." "I understand." "And the sleeping arrangement," Thomas continued, clearly uncomfortable but pushing through. "I meant what I said about separate rooms, but the cabin's small. People will expect us to share. If you want, I can build a partition in my room, give us each our own space behind a closed door. Might quiet some of the talk." Evelyn considered this. A partition would mean maintaining the fiction of a normal marriage while preserving their privacy. It was practical, thoughtful, exactly the kind of solution Thomas would devise. "That seems reasonable," she said. "Good." Thomas looked relieved. "And if anything changes, if you want different arrangements, you tell me. This is supposed to make your life better, not harder." "It already has," Evelyn said softly. "Made my life better, I mean. Just being here, having work and purpose, and—" She gestured at the cabin around them. "And people who treat me like I matter. That's more than I had." "You do matter," Thomas said. "To the girls, to the running of this place." He paused. "To me." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither seemed quite ready to examine. Before Evelyn could respond, footsteps pounded overhead, the girls waking up, remembering what day it was. "It's today," Maggie's voice carried clearly. "Lila, wake up, it's today." Thomas smiled slightly. "No backing out now." "Wouldn't dream of it," Evelyn said, and meant it. The morning passed in a controlled chaos of last-minute preparations. Lila insisted on arranging Evelyn's hair, managing to create something approximating an upswept style despite limited materials and expertise. Maggie picked fresh flowers for a bouquet, mixing wildflowers and sage into a bundle that smelled like the prairie itself. Evelyn dressed carefully in the blue dress, now fitted properly to her frame, and pinned Thomas's mother's lace collar at her throat. The ring Thomas had bought sat waiting on her small shelf, catching light from the window. She looked at herself in the fragment of mirror the girls had propped up for her and barely recognized the woman looking back, clean, properly dressed, with color in her cheeks and hope in her eyes. "You look beautiful," Lila said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. "Like a real bride," Maggie added, squeezing in beside her sister. "Thank you, girls," Evelyn said, kneeling to embrace them both. "For everything. For choosing me that day in town. For defending me, for making me part of your family." "You were always part of our family," Lila said fiercely. "We just had to make it official." Pastor Michaels arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding a sensible mare and carrying his Bible in a worn leather satchel. He was a thin man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every variation of human struggle and learned not to judge. "Thomas," he said, dismounting. "Mrs. Hale. Girls, thank you for having me." "Thank you for coming," Thomas said, shaking his hand. The pastor looked around at the simple cabin, at the wildflowers in jars, at the small gathering of 4 people preparing for a wedding. "Shall we begin? I find the simple ceremonies are often the most meaningful." They gathered in the main room, Thomas and Evelyn facing each other while the girls stood to one side and Pastor Michaels took his place between them. Through the open door, Evelyn could see the land stretching away toward the mountains, endless and indifferent and somehow beautiful in its vast emptiness. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Michaels began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Reed and Evelyn Hale in holy matrimony." The words washed over Evelyn in a wave of memory and present reality mixing together. Her first wedding had been in a church full of people, with Daniel young and hopeful beside her in a future that had seemed limitless. This wedding was quiet, small, born from necessity rather than romance. But standing here with Thomas's steady gaze on her and the girls watching with shining eyes, it felt no less significant. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, the pastor continued, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted. Thomas, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do, Thomas said, clear and certain. Evelyn, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? Evelyn's voice caught in her throat. This was it, the moment that changed everything. She looked at Thomas, at this quiet man who'd offered her shelter and protection and a place in his family without asking for anything she wasn't willing to give. She thought about the weeks since that day in town, about the rhythm they'd found, about the home they'd built together without quite meaning to. I do, she said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her bones. Thomas pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out. Pastor Michaels nodded, and Thomas took Evelyn's left hand with surprising gentleness. With this ring, Thomas said, his voice steady, I thee wed. The band slid onto her finger, a perfect fit, warm gold against her work-roughened skin. Evelyn stared at it, the symbol of belonging, and felt tears blur her vision. By the power vested in me, Pastor Michaels said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He smiled. You may kiss the bride if you're so inclined. Thomas looked at Evelyn, a question in his eyes. She nodded, just barely, and he leaned forward to press a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It was over almost before it began. Nothing like the passionate kiss she remembered from her first wedding, but it felt honest, real, a promise sealed with appropriate solemnity. Congratulations, Pastor Michaels said warmly. May your marriage be blessed with health, happiness, and mutual understanding. Maggie let out a whoop of joy and threw herself at Evelyn, nearly knocking her over. Lila followed more sedately, but her hug was just as fierce. We have a mama now, Maggie said into Evelyn's dress. A real, official, legal mama. You do, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. If you'll have me. We already had you, Lila said pragmatically. This just makes it official. Pastor Michaels stayed for a simple meal and a slice of Emma Patterson's cake, offering quiet congratulations and carefully not asking about the unusual circumstances that had brought about this marriage. When he left, he clasped Thomas's hand warmly and told Evelyn she was welcome at church services any time, with or without her husband. You've made a good choice, he said to Thomas. Both of you have. After he rode away, the four of them stood in the yard, the afternoon sun slanting long shadows across the ground. Evelyn looked down at her ring, still not quite believing it was real. Well, Thomas said eventually, I suppose we're married now. Suppose we are, Evelyn agreed. Does everything feel different? Maggie asked, looking between them expectantly. Not different, Lila said before either adult could answer. Just more settled, more right. She was correct, Evelyn realized. Nothing fundamental had changed. They'd still wake up tomorrow and do the same work, eat the same meals, navigate the same daily rhythms. But there was a rightness to it now, a sense that all the pieces had finally clicked into place. That evening, Thomas built a partition in his bedroom as promised, using spare lumber and canvas to create two distinct spaces within the same room. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional, giving each of them privacy while maintaining the appearance of a shared sleeping arrangement. This work for you? He asked when it was finished. Evelyn stood in her new space, small but hers, with a window looking out toward the mountains and enough room for a bed and trunk. It's perfect, thank you. You're my wife now, Thomas said, as if that explained everything. Your comfort matters. The word wife still felt strange, too big and official to fit properly, but Evelyn was learning to sit with strangeness, to let new realities settle over her like well-worn clothes. That night, as the house quieted and the girls drifted to sleep, Evelyn lay in her new bed in her new room and listened to Thomas breathing on the other side of the partition. They were married now, legally bound, partners in the eyes of law and community. The knowledge should have felt heavy, oppressive, like a trap closing. Instead, it felt like safety, like the kind of solid ground she could build on without fear it would crumble beneath her feet. The next 2 weeks proved the marriage's practical value immediately. Word spread quickly through the community. Thomas Reed had married the widow Hale, made her respectable, given her children a mother, and himself a helpmate. The gossip didn't stop entirely, but it shifted in tone from scandalized speculation to grudging acceptance. When they went to church the following Sunday, Margaret Crenshaw's face was a study in frustrated disapproval, but she couldn't manufacture outrage over a legal marriage performed by their own pastor. A few people offered stiff congratulations, others simply nodded acknowledgement. The Pattersons made a point of sitting near them, Emma squeezing Evelyn's hand with genuine warmth. "See," she whispered, "told you it would work out." The real test came on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the wedding. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard a familiar horse approaching. Her stomach clenched as Jacob Hale rode into the yard, his expression thunderous. She stood slowly, dirt on her hands and dress, and walked to meet him. This time she wasn't alone. Thomas emerged from the barn, tools in hand, and came to stand beside her. The girls appeared on the porch, watchful and ready. "Jacob," Evelyn said evenly. "Heard you got married," Jacob said without preamble. "Thought I'd come verify it myself." "It's true," Thomas said. "Evelyn's my wife. Legal and binding." Jacob's jaw worked. "You married her? Actually married her? I thought you had more sense than that." "I have exactly enough sense to know a good thing when I see it," Thomas said. "Now, unless you've got actual business here, I suggest you move along." "Business?" Jacob's laugh was bitter. "How about the business of watching my brother's widow whore herself to the first man who'd have her?" Thomas moved faster than Evelyn had ever seen him move, closing the distance between himself and Jacob in 2 long strides. He didn't raise his hand, didn't make any threatening gesture, but something in his stance made Jacob's horse sidestep nervously. "You're going to apologize," Thomas said quietly, "and then you're going to leave and not come back. Because if you ever speak about my wife that way again, we're going to have a very different conversation." "Your wife," Jacob spat. "You think a piece of paper makes her respectable? You think—" "I think she's worth 10 of you," Thomas interrupted. "I think she survived things that would have broken lesser people. I think she works harder than anyone I know and treats my daughters with more kindness than they've seen since their mother died. And I think you're a bitter man who can't stand seeing someone escape the cage you tried to put them in." The words landed like blows. Jacob's face went red, then white, his hands clenching on the reins. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Thomas said flatly. "Evelyn's married now. She's got legal protection, a home, a family. There's nothing you can do to her, no claims you can make, no threats you can hold over her head. She's beyond your reach, and that eats at you, doesn't it? Knowing you don't have power over her anymore?" Jacob opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to struggle with himself. Finally, he jerked his horse's head around. "You'll regret this," he threw over his shoulder. "I doubt it," Thomas said. They watched Jacob ride away, dust rising behind his horse. When he was out of sight, Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You all right?" Thomas asked. Evelyn looked at him, this man who'd just defended her with the kind of fierce certainty she'd never expected to inspire in anyone. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I'm free." And she was. Free from Jacob's threats, free from the fear of being turned out, free from the constant anxiety of temporary shelter that could disappear at any moment. The ring on her finger meant something real: protection, belonging, a place in the world that nobody could take away. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said to him, about me being worth something." "Wasn't a lie," Thomas said simply. "Just the truth." That evening, after the girls were in bed, Thomas and Evelyn sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The day's heat had given way to pleasant coolness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. "Been thinking," Thomas said eventually, "that maybe we should talk about the future. What you want, what the girls need, how we want to handle things going forward." "What do you want?" Evelyn asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I want the girls to grow up safe and happy. Want them to see that family can be built on respect and partnership, not just on romance. Want them to learn that people deserve second chances, that circumstances don't define worth. He paused. And I want you to feel like this is really your home, not just a place you're staying. It does feel like home, Evelyn said softly. More than anywhere has in a long time. Good. Thomas shifted in his chair. Because I've been thinking we might expand the garden next spring. Maybe get a few pigs, increase the flock. If we work together, we could build something real here, something sustainable. We? Evelyn noticed the pronoun, the way he'd shifted from talking about his plans to their plans. We're partners now, Thomas said, legally and practically. Seems like we should plan together, build together. He looked at her, his expression serious. If that's what you want. What Evelyn wanted was suddenly blazingly clear. She wanted this, the quiet partnership, the shared purpose, the slow building of trust and regard. She wanted these girls calling her mama and meaning it. She wanted to wake up every morning knowing she had a place, a purpose, people who valued her presence instead of tolerating it. Yes, she said, that's what I want. Then that's what we'll do. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead, as the night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, as the cabin behind them settled into sleeping quiet. Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the degradation, the desperate hunger, the day she'd been dragged through town by her hair while everyone watched. She thought about two little girls stepping into the street with fierce certainty, about a quiet man offering work instead of charity, about the slow accumulation of days that had transformed survival into something like living. 6 weeks ago, she'd had nothing. Now she had everything that mattered. Miss Evelyn? Maggie's voice came from inside, sleepy and small. Can you tuck me in again? Evelyn smiled and stood. I'll be right there, sweetheart. She's going to milk that for all it's worth, Thomas said with amusement. The tucking in, I mean. I know, Evelyn said. I don't mind. She went inside to where Maggie was waiting, covers pulled up to her chin and eyes already drooping. Lila was awake too, pretending to read but clearly listening. Mama, Maggie said as Evelyn smoothed her blanket, are you happy now? Evelyn thought about how to answer, about all the complicated emotions that comprised her current state, relief and gratitude and tentative hope, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been running for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. Yes, she said simply. I'm happy. Good, Maggie murmured, already sliding into sleep. You deserve to be happy. After the girls were truly asleep, Evelyn returned to the porch. Thomas was still there, now smoking his pipe, the tobacco smoke sweet in the night air. They're good girls, she said, sitting back down. They are. Thanks in large part to you. They were good before I got here. They were surviving, Thomas corrected. Now they're thriving. There's a difference. Evelyn looked at him in the starlight, at the solid outline of him in the darkness. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think... She struggled for words. Do you think marriages that start practical can become something more? Over time, I mean. Thomas took his time answering, drawing on his pipe, considering the question with his usual deliberation. I think people who work together, who respect each other, who build something worth keeping, I think that's as solid a foundation as any, maybe more solid than starting with just feelings that might fade. He looked at her. Why do you ask? Evelyn wasn't entirely sure how to explain the shift she'd felt over the past weeks, the way her awareness of Thomas had changed from simple gratitude to something warmer, more complex, the way she'd started noticing the competent grace of his hands while he worked, the rare smile that transformed his serious face, the patience he showed with his daughters. Just wondering, she said, about possibilities. Thomas was quiet, but she felt his attention sharpen. Possibilities are good, he said finally. No rush on anything, but I'm not opposed to seeing where things go. Naturally, I mean, without forcing it. Naturally, Evelyn agreed, feeling something ease in her chest. They sat together as the night deepened, two people who'd found each other through circumstance rather than choice, but were choosing to stay anyway. The future stretched ahead, uncertain as all futures were, but no longer terrifying. Whatever came, they'd face it together, as partners, as parents, as people who'd learned that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unlikely beginnings. Inside the cabin, the girls slept safe and warm. In the barn, the animals settled for the night. Across the prairie, the wind moved through the grass like breathing. And on the porch of a small cabin by a creek, two people sat in comfortable silence, rings on their fingers and hope in their hearts, building something real out of broken pieces. Evelyn looked down at her wedding ring, at the gold band that caught starlight and gleamed. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, desperate, nameless, discarded. And she thought about the woman she was now. Evelyn Reed, wife and mother, partner and homemaker, someone with a place and a purpose, and people who called her family. The transformation still felt impossible, like a story that had happened to someone else. But the ring was real. The calluses on her hands from honest work were real. The sleepy voices of children calling her mama were real. This was her life now. Not the one she'd imagined, not the one she'd planned for, but the one she'd been given through a combination of desperation, kindness, and the fierce determination of two little girls who'd decided she was worth saving. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. "Getting late," Thomas said eventually, tapping out his pipe. "Should probably turn in." "Probably," Evelyn agreed, but neither of them moved immediately. "Evelyn?" Thomas's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Yes?" "I'm glad you stayed. Glad you said yes. Just wanted you to know that." Evelyn felt warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the last lingering shadows of doubt. "I'm glad too," she said, "gladder than I know how to say." They went inside together, Thomas banking the fire while Evelyn checked on the sleeping girls one last time. Then they retired to their separate sides of the partition, to the privacy they'd both needed, to beds that felt less lonely, knowing someone was just on the other side of a thin wall. Evelyn lay in the darkness, listening to the cabin settle around her, to Thomas's breathing growing slower and deeper, to the absolute quiet of a house at peace. She thought about tomorrow. There would be bread to bake and eggs to collect and 100 small tasks that made up the fabric of daily life. There would be challenges too, no doubt. People who still judged, circumstances that tested, the ongoing work of building trust and partnership with a man she was still learning to know. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. She was warm and fed and safe. She had children who loved her and a husband who respected her. She had purpose and place and the promise of tomorrow. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. Inside, Evelyn Reed closed her eyes and slept without fear for the first time in 3 years, dreaming of gardens that would grow come spring, of girls growing tall and strong, of a quiet man whose steady presence had become the foundation of everything good in her world. She'd been dragged through the dust and left for nothing. But 2 children had chosen her anyway, and in choosing her, they'd given her back herself. They'd given her a second chance at life, at family, at believing she deserved to take up space in the world. And she would spend the rest of her days proving them right, loving them fiercely, and building with her own 2 hands the kind of home where everyone knew they were chosen, valued, and permanently, irrevocably loved. The story that had begun with humiliation in a dusty street ended here, in this small cabin, with a woman who'd learned that sometimes being saved means learning to save yourself, and that family is built not just from blood or romance, but from the deliberate choice to keep showing up, keep trying, and keep believing that broken things can be made whole again. Evelyn Reed had found her home, and she was never, ever letting it go.